Many thanks to the organizers of this event for putting me in the program. It's a real honor. And I'm more than a little bit intimidated, not only by being next to the performers, but also standing in front of audience folks who really know more about this than I do. So I'm going to try very hard not to embarrass myself. And if we'll just keep between us that I did so badly, I'd really appreciate that. Now, I know what my job is. It's about a little bit after 3 o'clock, and this time of day means that everybody's entering into that mid-afternoon lull. So I'm going to undertake to help everybody get ready for what everybody really came for, which was not me, but the performance that's coming. That is, I want everybody to recover their strength. So, what I'm going to try to do in the next 10 or 15 minutes is put everybody to sleep. So you can have some rest, recover your strength, and when I'm done, I'll wake everybody up, and then you'll be ready to see what you really came for. Now, on the way towards boring everybody silly, what I want to say is just a little bit about the Natyashastra. A lot of you are already nodding your heads. You know what the Natyashastra is, and some of this introduction is going to be elementary. For those of you who haven't encountered this, here's the short version of the whole story. The theater form that's coming here in a moment, Kathakali, it develops historically in the 16th, 17th, 18th centuries, but it develops partly dependent upon some other theater forms, Yadam, Krishnadam, and some other forms. They, in turn, hang, ultimately, if you keep following the historical line backwards, all these forms hang on what we call classical Sanskrit drama. As the name suggests, this is drama that was done in Sanskrit back at one time, and actually a lot of the language that you'll be encountering here is Sanskrit as well. So now we're winding back in the historical line to about 3rd, 4th, 5th century CE. This is when classical Sanskrit drama really gets off the ground. And at the same time that it's getting off the ground, we have in development this text that we call the Natyashastra. Now, dating this text is a little tricky. Some people will date it actually much earlier than I personally do. Some people date the Natyashastra text to 1st, 2nd century BCE. There are good reasons for that. I tend to set it a little bit later, partly because of the way that the text seems to talk to classical Sanskrit drama. The Natyashastra is this book that asserts itself as kind of like a rule book. That is, it's got very detailed instructions for how to do things. All sorts of things connected with theater. How to make props, how to design scenery, how to move on stage, how to make the appropriate musical instruments, how to play those musical instruments, what the right kinds of rhythms are for various kinds of performances. I mean, it's extensive in its detailed explanation of how to do things. One of the reasons that I tend to personally set the composition date from Natyashastra a little later is because what seems to be going on in classical Sanskrit drama in the 3rd and 4th century doesn't perfectly coincide with what the Natyashastra is saying. So, I mean, this is circumstantial evidence. But it seems like in those centuries, classical Sanskrit drama is developing alongside those instructions that we get from the Natyashastra. I mean, I don't know how much of this is necessary, but for instance, right, we get this one-act classical Sanskrit drama from a guy named Rasa in probably the 2nd century CE called Urupangam. And it's about Duryodhana at the end of the Mahabharata war, and something very peculiar happens at the end of this classical Sanskrit drama. Those of you who know it already know what's peculiar about it, and that is Duryodhana dies on stage. Now, what you're supposed to do when I say that is gasp. There's supposed to be like this collective gasp throughout the audience. Everybody goes, dies on stage. No, you can't do that. Why can't you do that? Because the Natyashastra says you can't do that. The Natyashastra says, no deaths on stage, period. And yet we have at least one, probably the only one, but nevertheless, we have one. in classical Sanskrit drama. And this is to suggest, circumstantially again, that the writer, that the Natyashastra was not fully composed, perhaps, not regarded yet as authoritative in the 2nd century when Rasa was writing this one-act play, and broke the rules. Broke the rules very well. That's a great play. Go pick up a copy of that. Okay, so why is Natyashastra relevant anyway? Well, there are a lot of people here who know a whole lot more about Kathakali than I do. So rather than talk about that, let me just say a couple of things about theory. Now you're all really going to sleep. Or hoping that you can quickly. But the theory is kind of interesting. So in some ways, the Natyashastra looks like the Poetics, right? Aristotle's book on theater. Some of you probably read this in high school. It's not a very long book. But better than, I don't mind saying better, I guess, better than Aristotle's Poetics, Natyashastra is invested in actually doing theater. Aristotle couldn't care less really about performance, and that's just the truth of it. The Natyashastra is really concerned about what happens on stage, and certainly much more than Aristotle. The Natyashastra is concerned with audiences. This is what I think is really a unique contribution from the Natyashastra to the way that we think about theater. Aristotle was concerned about playwrights, and seemed to think that the playwright had magical powers. If he just did things right, then he would make things happen in theater. The Natyashastra understands that performers aren't the only ones who are in the building. Right? You all are here. And the Natyashastra tries to articulate what might be happening with you all, audience members. So, for the most part, the Natyashastra is concerned with how to do this, how to do that. It goes on at great length. But there's this one little bit, book 6, or chapter 6, we might say. It's only a few pages long. And it's concerned with what the Natyashastra calls Rasa. And Rasa ends up being really important, all the way to the modern day, an important concept for talking about the arts in the South Asian context, in the context of India. So, you know, when folks carry on conversations about novels and film and photography and dance and music in South Asia, very often this term Rasa comes up. But the Natyashastra is really only concerned with theater. And eventually this term, Rasa, gets to be so important that it gets extrapolated and applied to all sorts of performing arts. Well, not just performing arts, but like I said, novels, poetry, and all that sort of thing. Falls under Rasa. Now, what is Rasa? Nobody knows. So why I'm up here, I'm not exactly sure. It's really cryptically written, book 6 is. But there's probably a very good reason for this. What our Natyashastra author is trying to articulate is something that really is in a very literal way metaphysical. And as soon as we start moving into an area that is beyond our experience, we're also moving into an area that is beyond the words that we have to talk about things. So this is part of the reason why book 6 is so cryptic, because we've got an author who's really trying to give words to something for which there aren't any words. Now, one of the consequences of speaking so cryptically is everybody's got a different idea of what Rasa is, and that's fine. Let me try to articulate what my idea of Rasa is. So our Natyashastra book 6 author, in trying to help everyone understand Rasa, resorts to talking about food. Almost right off the bat, within the first few verses, he's talking about food. And he starts talking about a really good meal. And he partly adopts this because he's quite sure that everybody has this experience. Everybody's eaten a good meal at some point or another. So this is a broadly applicable metaphor. So he starts talking about a meal. Well, when you are dining, somebody serves you up a really nice meal, and in the process of preparing that meal, there's a lot of mixing going on back in the kitchen where you all, the audience, aren't allowed. So back there, we got pots and baskets and all sorts of other things, and everything's going into the pot and getting mixed up together, all these various flavors and textures and aromas and all of that stuff. And eventually, it's all brought out, set in front of you, and you, the very, what should we say, refined might say connoisseur, the very experienced eater, you know how to appreciate this. Even before the food comes out, you can smell it. And that smell begins your aesthetic experience with the meal. Eventually, you get to dig in. And so what our Natyashastra author tries to concentrate your attention on this moment where you put some food in your mouth finally. There's already been a lot of activity. You're sitting around with friends, you're having nice conversation, perhaps there's some music, the aroma is coming out of the kitchen, and that's all already mixing around in your head. And that affects the way that you experience that first bite. And that first bite goes in your mouth, and then you get to start sorting through all of those textures and flavors that have been combined in this pot that's been brought out and set in front of you. And there's a certain kind of experience that goes along with sorting through all of those textures and flavors. Well, that experience, suggests our Natyashastra author, is Rasa. But, let me add my caveat. Because I think this is very commonly misunderstood, certainly by Western scholars. The whole food thing is a metaphor. The Natyashastra author, I almost certainly, does not mean for us to start thinking in literal terms about the flavors of theater that we're encountering. The food thing is a metaphor that our author knows can spread quite widely, everybody can access, and he wants you to think, I'm pretty sure, about this business of encountering food in an abstract way. What is that abstract way? Well, you might ask yourself, when you taste something, what is doing the tasting? Now, the biochemists and the doctors in the congregation here are probably thinking, well, we can explain that. It's all a chemical process. You've got a tongue, and that's got certain functions and certain sensory capacities, and you've got saliva, and that starts breaking down starches, and that's a particular kind of experience, and we can go on and on and on. Well, you know, we could, understanding all the chemistry means that we could, to a certain extent, replicate this process of tasting in a literal way in a laboratory. We can make, I'm sure we can make synthesized saliva, and in some ways imitate, in a very dehumanized laboratory setting, this business of tasting food. That's not what our Natyashastra author is getting at. What he wants you to think about is how you have an experience of really tasty food. And that experience can only come from being conscious. And the laboratory is not going to be conscious, even though we can perhaps replicate the chemical processes involved. The laboratory is not itself going to be self-conscious of its own experience. And that's the thing that fascinates our Natyashastra author, the fact that we are self-conscious and we can reflect on the experience that we're having. It's not just the flavor, it's the fact that we can say to ourselves, that tastes really good. The laboratory can't do that. This is the unique thing that we're all endowed with by whatever power, right? So our Natyashastra author, exercising, I think, considerable more insight than Aristotle, says there's something really significant about the fact that we can say to ourselves, that really tastes good. What that statement suggests is that we have the capacity not only to taste something, but we have a capacity to examine our own existence as though our own existence were an art object. We're not only saying, when we say, that tastes really good, that the food that we're tasting tastes good, we're also making a comment on the experience of tasting that food. It's not just the food that tastes good, but my experience as well has a kind of flavor to it. The metaphysical sensibility that I have that invests a quality in the experience, that's also something that I, because I'm conscious, can look at sort of from a distance and appreciate, even in the same way that you might consider a painting, right? Everybody's done this. You go walking into a museum, or an art gallery, and there's a painting on the wall. And what do? Well, you go like this. Right? And you might stand there for 10 minutes if it's a really good painting. Because the painting's an art object, right? It's a thing that you can focus your attention on. It's separate from you. It's over there. There's some distance between you. And you can apply your evaluative faculties to the quality of that painting. Well, think about this. I think this is what the Natyashastra author is really getting at. What about your own experience? Can your own experience of food or art itself be an object of your consideration? As though your experience of kathakali, which is coming, is something that you could put on a wall and stand back from and go like this. Self-consciousness allows us to do that, to think of ourselves and our own experiences of things as something to be enjoyed. So this is what the Natyashastra author is getting at. You enjoy theater, but you also, if you really know what you're doing as an audience member, you can also enjoy your own experience of kathakali or kuliyanam or whatever it is you're watching. And that, when you step back and look at the experience that you're having of theater, you discover that there's a tone, a particular tone to that experience. And so the Natyashastra says, because the Natyashastra, if nothing else, really likes to categorize things. And so there's all these lists and hierarchies and boxes that everything gets put into, and our own personal experience gets put into 8 boxes. All the experiences that you're having, at least in an art circumstance, says the Natyashastra, can be put into one of perhaps 8 boxes. So as you step back from your experience of theater and you look at that experience, you might get the sense that the overriding tone of that experience is one of love. That's very popular in theater. Or fear, of course, because plays might be scary. Or humor. But even so far as to say that this experience might be characterized by something like disgust. That's one of the boxes that the Natyashastra gives us. Your experience might be so disgusting that it becomes beautiful when you step back and examine it as your experience. Now, ultimately, and this will be my last point, and then I'll turn you over to what is really important. Ultimately, we end up getting, several centuries after the composition of the Natyashastra, an additional box, or an additional rasa. We've got 8 that are enumerated in the Natyashastra. But later commentators, principally a guy named Abhinavagupta and some others, but principally him, now we're going into the 9th, 10th century CE, they look at this aesthetic theory and they say, this is really interesting. If what the Natyashastra says is true, and it sure seems to be given our own experience, that you can step back and look at your own experience from a sort of metaphysical distance, then that suggests that by doing that, you are in some ways transcending your own physical existence, right? Like putting your experience on the wall in the art gallery and looking at it. If you can create that kind of distance between your consciousness and your experience, that implies that there can be some distance between what you might be calling you as an individual and the experience that you're having. Well, that's really intriguing to people who are really interested in figuring out how religion works, which is what Abhinavagupta's business was. So by the 10th century, he sees that this whole rasa theory can be really useful in talking about religion. And after Abhinavagupta, we get a 9th rasa, the Shanti rasa, added to the boxes, so as to show us that there's a certain experience which eludes all particular qualities. It's not love, it's not fear, it's not anger, it's not disgust. It's somehow even bigger and broader and more elusive than that. And that ends up, that Shanti rasa, that 9th rasa, is the link that India makes in the 10th, the 11th century between art and religion. They both converge in this theory of Rasa because of what Rasa says about experience and how it can imply one's transcendent nature. I shouldn't bore you any more than that. I don't know if they're ready, but I think I'm going to get out of your way, assuming that everybody's prepared. What do we say? Okay, well that gesture. So here I'm saying, you, the audience, really matter, right? The Natyashastra says it's not just the performers here. In order to get to that Rasa thing, you've got to do some work. This is your labor to undertake. I mean, the performers will do what they can do, right? But they're kind of in the mixture. And with all apologies to the performers, they can't experience Rasa. There was an argument about this for a while in India, and ultimately it got resolved in saying, nope, the actors, they can't experience Rasa. I'm sorry, it's not my fault, I didn't write the book. Because they're mixed up in the middle of it. You've got to have some separation from what's going on, including separation from yourself in order to get there. So that's the labor that I'm going to leave you with. You've got to undertake that work as an audience member if you're really going to wring out of Kathakali what is there to be wrung out of. That's a terrible sentence. I shouldn't end on that, but I'm going to. Thank you much.